tell me you got 30, count me off 30 seconds if you would. Just only 30 seconds elapsed.
Starting now.
No, I'm not.
Like I said, if I don't give you a sunburn, I make you sweat. So one way or the other, I can't seem to keep you out of trouble here.
And we're rolling, gentlemen.
Well, Walter, it's good to see you again.
It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
And to bring these wonderful people with you.
Well, you know, I think today we've talked in the past and had a good time at your place in Salt Springs, and today I think it would be good to go back to Peleliu a little bit.
Pat, could you first just have his name and where he was born?
Oh, okay. I thought I heard you already say that. Okay, so why don't you tell us your name, the date you were born, and where you were born?
My name is Walter F. Brown. I was born in Port Tampa, Florida, January 18th, 1921.
And you've pretty much, aside from your time in the service, lived most of your life in Florida?
It's in Bradenton, Florida.
In Bradenton.
Except for 4 years in Beaumont, Texas. We lived in Bradenton, Florida, until I left there and went into service.
And when was that?
Oh, 1943, I guess it was.
43.
42.
43.
I just completed my third year in college. And had my draft notice. And I didn't want to be drafted because I was being educated to go in the naval service. I always wanted to be a naval aviator. And I just rushed on down to the naval recruiting office and signed up.
You'd already had some flying lessons by then.
In college, I had primary and secondary civilian pilot training.
And once you started flying in the Navy, you rapidly got into dive bombing. Is that right?
Torpedo. We started in University of Georgia Pre-Flight School. And went through pre-flight school and got all the basics of the Navy, introduced you to the Navy, and we also studied Navy aviation there, courses and engines, aircraft, and navigation, and we were introduced to it there. And from there I went to Dallas, Texas, and Naval Aviation School there. And that was where we took our primary training. I think Love Field was on one side, the Navy was on one side, and then North American Factory was on the other side. And we had to ride in those cattle wagons they had out to Fort Worth, Texas, to the grass fields out there where we started our primary training in the into S1.
Okay.
We call them Yellow Perils.
Okay. And were those the Stearmans?
Stearman.
And then from there you went to?
I went to Pensacola. You had to complete the course there and do a satisfactory job, and then you went on to Pensacola for finishing out.
And when did you get to torpedo bombers?
Well, I graduated from Pensacola as a torpedo bomber pilot.
Okay.
But had never flown the torpedo bomber. I mean, it was all done in the Stearman, not Stearman, in the, tell me what it is.
Was it, did you do
SNJs, everything was done in SNJs. And we had all kinds of night flying and instrument flying and everything else. We were supposed to be a qualified naval aviator. When we left there, we received our wings and I accepted a commission in the Marine Corps instead of the Navy. I'd always wanted to be a Marine aviator.
Tell me why you wanted to be a Marine aviator. I mean, you grew up around Pensacola with all the Navy there. How was it that you got to be a Marine?
Well, we saw the Marines on Guadalcanal, and they were in combat, and they didn't show too much of the Navy back in those days. And it just appealed to me that I could get in combat faster if I'd get in the Marine Corps.
So you wanted to get into combat?
I wanted to get in combat, yes. Mm-hmm.
And from, let's see, you're now a qualified torpedo bomber pilot.
No, I had to go through, we went down to, we had our orders down to Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station. It was a brand new Naval Air Station down there, a beautiful site. And just outside of the town of Fort Lauderdale. And we started at 7. When we got to the station there, the first thing we did was hand us the book on the TBF torpedo bomber and said, read this and study it carefully, and then you can pass a blind full cockpit checkout, then you can take the plane up. So we studied all night long and got proficient in what was there, and we had to put our hand on each instrument when they asked us what it was, and we'd be blindfolded. And I passed it along with all my buddies there, and we were qualified to go out and check out a TBF and go by ourselves without any other crewmen or anything in it. So we grabbed a parachute and went out, got in the old torpedo bomber and taxied out to the takeoff line. And when I started down the runway, it felt like a train going down there, so heavy, after flying smaller aircraft and lighter aircraft, and this was a pretty heavy piece of equipment. And we went down the runway, and I had it trimmed, I thought, and it didn't seem like I was taking off, so I eased back on the elevator trim tab there, and then I finally felt myself going into the air, and got up and flew all over top of Fort Lauderdale. We'd pick out a nice flat top cloud, a cumulus cloud, and go over and make an approach on it and come in and kind of drop in for a landing in the top of the cloud, and then recover before we went down too far. But that was the beginning of it, and then we went through what they call the syllabus. It was all of the things you had to know, and most everything you had to know. Flying a torpedo bomber, you had to learn to fly it first. Then you had to learn something about torpedoes and how to drop them, and what the plane was capable of in any kind of maneuver. And that went on for several weeks, and we started off by dropping concrete torpedoes just to get the feel of the weight of the airplane. And when they added that to it, it didn't feel like you'd ever take off. And later on we'd go out and take the regular torpedo. It didn't have a warhead on it, but it was a regular torpedo in there, and that was the exact weight you'd be carrying. And we would qualify that day on that, and then later on we'd go out and they would put a ship out to sea, and you drop a torpedo on the ship with the torpedo set that would go under the keel of the ship you were dropping on. And it was the torpedo bomber sight, you had to learn how to use that, and you had to know all about the characteristics of the airplane. It was a plane used for not dive bombing, but what's the name of it? Just a shallow dive.
Mm-hmm.
And that along with torpedo bombing. You had a turret up in the top there with 2 50 caliber machine guns, and then you had a little 30 caliber down in the radio compartment, which was down below the tail. And it was a good stable aircraft. It had a seat in there with an armrest on it, and I felt like I was riding in style and in comfort.
And how was it that you got to be, how did you switch to Corsairs? What's the story behind that?
Well, when we finished our training at Fort Lauderdale, we were shipped out to the receiving station in California. And from there we was ordered up to the Goleta Marine Corps Air Station at Santa Barbara. And while there, I only flew one time, and they didn't have any planes to speak of there, just enough to occasionally get a hop, and just one hop is all I had. And we didn't get to do anything in maneuvers or anything like that, or learn any more about torpedo bombing. And one day, some of the fellows were coming back from Guadalcanal from the fighter squadrons and came in to tell us a little about Guadalcanal and what was happening over there and what had happened over there. And of course, we'd always wanted to be fighter pilots to start off with, but we didn't fill out our list the way the others did when they said we want to be number 1 fighters, number 2 fighters, number 3 fighters, number 4 fighters. We said fighters, then torpedo bombers and dive bombers and like that. So we went down there and they didn't have anything, and these fellows came, I think it was Joe Foss and Marion Carl and Carl Smith, some of the names I remember.
Those are good names to remember. Came
back from Guadalcanal, and we had a meeting with all the pilots there. And their last comment was, they're not making any more squadrons for torpedo bomber squadrons in the Marine Corps, and we have enough qualified torpedo bomber pilots out in the islands already waiting to take place of anyone that's lost. So if you want to get in something else, let us know right after this meeting. And so Carmina Cooley and I just went right on up and said, we want to be fighter pilots. And they said, okay, check out of here and head for Mojave, California, the Marine Corps Air Station out there. Well, we went through everything, checking out from Santa Barbara, and got in an old 4-door Plymouth, or 2-door Plymouth car he had. I think that belonged to Carmina and Cooley. And we went over the mountains heading out for Mojave. Pulled in there, it was lightly snowing, just misting snow. And the mud was about 3 feet deep. And that's the first snow I'd ever seen. I've been raised in Florida. So we pulled up to the office area there, and some of the fellows we'd gone through training with come running out and say, hey, come on quick. We got 3 billets left in Marine Fighting Squadron 121.
And can I stop you there and have you 2 trade seats, please? Mm-hmm. Can I have you trade seats with Pat, please?
I sure can.
I just noticed something.
Let's go say that.
How to
do? You're reflecting in the glass?
There's something else.
My glasses?
No, sir. The VMF-121 right behind you, sir.
Oh.
Thank you. So that was how you joined VMF-121?
That's how we got out to VMF-121, and we went and checked in, and we went through the same procedure. We went over at the torpedo bomber school with. They gave us a pilot's manual to read and study. And I said, as soon as you get through and can take a blindfold cockpit check out and put your finger on any input when we call it out, then you can take the plane up. And we've had a lot of people already that have been telling us all about, you know how people do. They want to make it sound real good and then tough and all this stuff. And they said, now you got to watch that Corsair. When you take off, you're going to be at 10,000 feet before you know it. It wasn't quite that bad, but there was a little difference in the power and the weight of the plane.
So what do you remember about that first time when you flew it?
Well, I taxied out down to the end of the runway to take off and check my bags, and I just lined up and started down the runway, and it eased off into the air, and it did climb pretty good there compared to the torpedo bomber. Mm-hmm. And that was a nice feeling, and I thought, boy, here I go. we had fun. We enjoyed it, and no one had any problems. However,
go ahead.
At one time, well, during this time when the little snow on the ground and it was melting, and all the mud off the edge of the runways was real deep. I mean, if you got off the runway, you were bogged down in the mud, and the runways were a little narrow. It was. At that time, before that, it had been a civilian airport, and the runways weren't really wide enough to do the type of work we were doing. And so they were out there redoing the runways, and one day you'd be into the wind taking off and landing. Next day it'd be 90 degrees to the wind taking off and landing, and we got all kind of experience with that. But we had no problems with it. Some of them flipped over on their backs, but I never had any problem at all with it.
Told me once about a little checkout ride that Major Meyer took you on where you had to follow him around.
That was just before we went overseas. We each flew on his wing, and he was checking each pilot out because he had more of a complement there than he needed of pilots to take overseas with us. They had to check some of them out and release them into another squadron. And I guess he didn't say well, this is what it was, but I think it was to just see how your flying was, your catch read. It was a test of what it was. And we went up through the mountains there and down the valleys and everything, and I was sucked in right under his wingtip there, and I thought I did a real good job of staying right with him there. And we were out there for, I don't know how long we were out, about almost an hour, and came back. And I don't know this to be a fact, but I think he was checking each pilot, and if you were checked off, you were all right to go out with him to Petaluma or wherever we were going. And if you didn't, then you'd be dropped out of the squadron.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel when you landed the plane?
From that trip?
Yeah.
I was exhausted, I'll tell you. I was flying in real tight. My wingtip was almost in his cockpit. And we were up loop-to-loops and rolls and everything there. And you had to stay right in there. You didn't vary from where your position was.
And time came when it was time to go overseas.
Well, we had been doing field carrier landings. That's where they have the a part on the beginning of the runway that's marked out about the size of I guess this was a Jeep carrier, one of the small carriers, converted Liberty ships. And we'd go out on that and had a landing signal officer that would flag you in, and you made a number of landings and come in, and he would give you the cut, and you would land. And when we got ready to go, we were called one day and said we were going to go aboard a carrier and do carrier qualification. So we flew our planes down to San Diego and were boomed aboard the USS Rudyard Bay and steamed on out to sea there, and we were getting going real good. My name being Brown with a B, I was one of the first. I think they went in alphabetical order there, and I got through with mine and qualified with no problems. It was a small deck to land on and all, but the reason we went out is because and you might want to scratch this out later, I don't know. But the scuttlebutt we had was that VMF, well, I'm not going to say that, I'm going to say 2 Navy squadrons that cracked up a lot of planes in trying to land on the carrier. And a colonel in Washington, as I understand, had hold of this letter, and he read it, and he said, well, that's our plane. We'll never be on carriers if we don't qualify them, so how about let us have a shot at it? And that's how we were ordered aboard the USS Rudyard Bay out there. And the wind's supposed to be at least 35 knots across the deck, so that makes the relative motion of your plane with a carrier drop in landing speed. And the wind kept dropping, and they kept steaming that thing up, and that particular ship and that variety of ship, I think the flank speed was 18 knots. So they had a pretty good wind, and the wind started dropping down, and it got to a certain point, the commanding officer of the carrier said, we're going to have to stop landing now. But you have qualified enough men that we can say your squadron is qualified. So that put us qualified, ready to go overseas. And we thought, hot dog man, we're going on a carrier and we're going to get out in the action now. And so we were shipped out to Espiritu Santos.
How did you go out there, on a Jeep carrier?
We went out on the USS Kwajalein. It was a Jeep carrier. Went across the international date line, and we had our ancient order, the deep things, and then the, what's the other one you get? It's awful to sit here and be like this. You can't remember hardly anything there. Then.
So you got to Espiritu Santo.
Mm-hmm.
You got to.
We got through over there, and then they did can you cut it off a minute here?
Espiritu Santo.
As we pulled into Espiritu Santos there, and we didn't have any planes at that time, but they moved all of our equipment and everything off to Turtle Bay, which was on Turtle Bay there in a big oak coconut grove with coconuts and coconut limbs falling all on you all the time. You had to be careful as you walked. And of course, being from Florida, I knew about coconut palms, and I could hear one start rattling, it was going to fall. But we staged out there, and finally they shipped our planes over to us, and our crews, the mechanics, and the all the people who worked on the planes were the greatest bunch that I think we could have had. We were blessed to have those fellows with us. And they started cutting out pieces of metal out of old Japanese tanks and mounting those in the bottom of our seat. And later on we'll be talking about getting shot down, and that I think is one of the things that saved me, because that metal kept the shrapnel from coming on up through the seat and tearing me up. But we stayed there, and we did familiarization flights around the whole area there to see just what the Pacific looked like, and to get familiar with the area, and check out the planes we had and be sure they were all in good working order. And we waited and waited and waited to find out when we were going to be sent up to a combat zone. And one day we got orders to start flying out. We didn't know where, but we were going to fly. They'd selected enough pilots to man all the planes we had, and I was lucky to be one of those. And we flew from Espiritu Santos on up to
Green Island? Was it Green Island?
No, I should have the book here where I can refer to some of these things. Anyhow, the place where we were going to stage out, it was a long strip all the way through the island. And when you landed, if you landed on the beginning of the landing strip, you had to taxi up on two wheels for maybe a mile to go down there to pick out where your revetment was and get you in there. And the pilots were to assist the mechanics and the other plane crews there to maintain the planes, because our ground echelon from 121 was going in with the invasion fleet, and they were in a board ship. We flew up and staged out there, and we were to assist the mechanics and the armors and all in working on our planes. And it was about 120 degrees every day when you got up there, and you could fry an egg on the wing of an airplane if you had one to fry. And we waited for the invasion fleet to go into Peleliu. We were told while there that we'd be going in an invasion of Peleliu. And so we got ready, and well, let's go back. The enlisted personnel who were on board ship went in with the landing force, and they unloaded the supplies on the docks and everything. Some of them were litter bearers to go out and bring in the wounded Marines, and they just were used any way they could be used until we got there with the planes. So we flew from there to Biak and spent the night, and then flew on into Peleliu on the next day. And remember, just as we were coming into the place there, the Seabees were bombing the harbor out, and a big geyser of water and rocks flew up near there, and I thought maybe the Japanese had got us zeroed in coming in there, but we found out what it was, and as we landed on the little coral strip, the fellows were out there to tell us and direct us right to the edge of the water. They said there's going to be a banzai attack tonight, and you're going to have to stay here around the edge of the water and sleep between the landing gear of your airplane. So we stayed there that night, and the attack never did come then. It came later. But we finally got into tents there and started doing routine flights. And we had a familiarization flights first, so you'd fly all over the Palau Islands. Which, by the way, is not just one little island. That's a string of islands and a long way from one end to the other. And we just familiarized ourselves with it and familiarized ourselves with our planes, and we did gunnery runs and drop bombs and everything else just to get going. And
what were your initial impressions of the Palau Islands?
It was beautiful up there. I mean, flying when you took off on an early morning and get up there, and you would be flying up the chain of islands, you'd be off the side of the island. You wouldn't be going over the islands, you'd be out over the water. And you could see that white water right off the beach with the white beaches, and then it turned to a kind of a greenish color, and then a light blue, and then to a deep azure blue as you went on out there. It was beautiful. Flying was beautiful. It's when you went into a fight, that's when it got kind of rough. But I enjoyed the flying and going over to Yap Island, flying over there and back and bombing that island, and flying over Ulithi where the fleet anchorage was, and most of the thing we did was bombing and strafing the Japanese troops that were on all of the islands. Babelthorpe was the largest island, and that was the largest concentration of Japanese troops there. And they had an airfield there too, and it was our duty to see that no Japanese aircraft could come in to the Palau Islands and be a threat to our troops on the ground.
Did you ever see any Japanese aircraft?
I never saw a Japanese aircraft in here, and that was one of my biggest disappointments, that I didn't get to do some dogfighting. But we had enough of it.
Because you had a lot of training in air-to-air combat.
That was all the way through. Back at Pensacola, we had that, and when we got into at Mojave there, it was a lot of the flights were just on combat dogfighting, is what they called it with when you meet an enemy aircraft.
And I'm going to have this happy fellas and